On the morning of August 6, 1945, Tsutomu Yamaguchi was in Hiroshima on a business trip. He was 29 years old. He was preparing to leave the city and return home when at 8:15 in the morning an atomic bomb exploded above Hiroshima. He survived, but 3 days later he was back in his hometown of Nagasaki. And on August 9, another atomic bomb exploded over that city. He survived that too. It sounds almost impossible. Man had been present in 2 cities that were hit by atomic bombs within 3 days of each other. His name was Tsutomu Yamaguchi. And decades later, the Japanese government officially recognized him as the only person to be certified as a survivor of both atomic bombings. But Yamaguchi's story is not simply about surviving something twice. It is about what happened before the bombs, what happened during those 3 days, and how one man carried the memory of both attacks for the rest of his life. Tsutomu Yamaguchi was born on March 16, 1916 in Nagasaki, Japan. He grew up during a period when Japan was becoming increasingly industrialized and militarized. As a young man, Yamaguchi eventually found work with Mitsubishi Heavy Industries. He became an engineer and worked on ship-related projects. By 1945, he was employed by Mitsubishi and was sent to Hiroshima on a business trip. The Second World War was still raging. Japan had been fighting for years, and by the summer of 1945, the country was under enormous pressure. The United States was carrying out a massive bombing campaign against Japanese cities, but the weapon that was about to be used against Hiroshima was unlike anything that had come before it. Yamaguchi had been in Hiroshima for business. He had spent time working there and was preparing to return to Nagasaki. On the morning of August 6, he was outside. He was about 3 kilometers from the center of the eventual explosion. Then at 8:15 everything changed. An American B-29 bomber called Enola Gay dropped an atomic bomb known as Little Boy over Hiroshima. The bomb exploded above the city. A blinding flash filled the sky. The blast struck the surrounding area with enormous force. Yamaguchi was caught in it. He suffered serious burns to his upper body. His hearing was also affected, and yet he survived. At that moment, however, he had no way of knowing what had happened. He had experienced something completely new. There had been bombings before, but this was different. A single bomb had devastated a huge part of a city. Hiroshima was in ruins. Yamaguchi eventually made his way to an air raid shelter. He spent the night there. He was injured, exhausted, and trying to understand what had happened. The scale of the destruction was almost impossible to grasp. Around him were thousands of people affected by the bombing. Some were dead, others were wounded, buildings had been destroyed, fires had spread through parts of the city. And yet Yamaguchi still had one thing in mind: he needed to get home. His home was in Nagasaki. The distance between Hiroshima and Nagasaki was roughly 300 kilometers by modern road routes, though the exact journey depended on the available transportation. The journey was difficult because the railway system had been disrupted by the war, but Yamaguchi eventually made his way back. He arrived in Nagasaki on August 8. That means that just 2 days after surviving the Hiroshima bombing, he was back home. He was injured. His body was wrapped in bandages. He was trying to recover. And then the next morning he went to work. This detail is one of the strangest parts of his story. Yamaguchi was not simply sitting at home waiting for the war to end. On August 9, he reported to his workplace at Mitsubishi in Nagasaki. He was speaking with his supervisor about what had happened in Hiroshima. Yamaguchi tried to explain that one bomb had destroyed much of the city. To someone who had not seen it, the claim was difficult to believe. How could one bomb destroy an entire city? But before the conversation could go much further, the world changed again. At 11:02 in the morning, an American B-29 bomber called Boxcar dropped an atomic bomb over Nagasaki. The bomb was called Fat Man. Yamaguchi was once again in the city. Once again, an atomic bomb exploded. And once again, he survived. The second blast threw him down. Buildings around him were damaged. The world became chaotic, but there was one major difference between the 2 attacks. This time, Yamaguchi was already injured from Hiroshima. He had returned home believing that the worst thing that had ever happened to him was behind him. Instead, he had found himself in another city that was now being devastated by another atomic bomb. The 2 attacks had happened only 3 days apart. Hiroshima had been attacked on August 6, Nagasaki was attacked on August 9, and Yamaguchi had been present in both cities. He was not simply someone who traveled through one city years after the bombing. He was there when both bombs exploded. That is what makes his story so extraordinary. After the Nagasaki bombing, Yamaguchi and his family spent time in a shelter near their damaged home. The destruction around Nagasaki was enormous. Approximately 70,000 people in Nagasaki were eventually estimated to have died as a result of the bombing and its immediate aftermath, although exact numbers are difficult to establish. In Hiroshima, the estimated death toll by the end of 1945 was around 140,000. These were not simply numbers. They represented families, workers, students, elderly people, and children whose lives were suddenly destroyed. Yamaguchi was one of the people who survived, but surviving did not mean escaping the consequences. He had been exposed to the effects of the first bombing, then he was exposed again in Nagasaki. For years afterward, the effects of the bombings remained part of his life. But immediately after the war, Yamaguchi tried to return to normal. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. The war was over. The country was devastated. Yamaguchi had survived 2 atomic bombings, but he still had to build a life after them. In the years following the war, he worked in different roles. He worked as a translator for American forces for a period. Later, he became a teacher. Eventually, he returned to Mitsubishi. He married and raised a family. For decades, however, the Hiroshima part of his official survivor record was not recognized in the same way as his Nagasaki experience. Yamaguchi was officially recognized as a survivor of the Nagasaki bombing. He received an atomic bomb victim health handbook, but when the document was renewed in 1960, the reference to his Hiroshima exposure was removed. That meant that for many years, the official record did not fully reflect what had happened to him. Why? Part of the reason was that Japan's system for recognizing survivors was complicated. The government had specific requirements for certification. Yamaguchi continued living with the memory of both attacks, even though only one was formally recognized. Then, as he grew older, he began speaking more openly about what he had experienced. He did not want his story to become simply a strange coincidence. He increasingly saw it as a reason to speak about nuclear weapons and the consequences of war. He wrote about his experiences. He became involved in peace activism, and he spoke publicly about what he had witnessed. His message was not that he was somehow lucky. In fact, describing his survival as simple luck would miss the point. Millions of people were affected by the atomic bombings. Most did not survive. Yamaguchi did, but he carried the consequences with him. He later developed serious health problems, including cancer. He also experienced hearing problems and other illnesses associated with his exposure. His family was affected as well. His son Katsutoshi survived the war but later died of cancer at the age of 59. Yamaguchi continued speaking about his experiences well into old age. He eventually became internationally known as a double atomic bomb survivor. But there is another important detail. Yamaguchi was not the only person who experienced both bombings. Historians have identified other people who were in Hiroshima and later Nagasaki. Some survivors traveled between the 2 cities in the days after the first bombing. So the idea that Yamaguchi was literally the only human being to survive both explosions is not accurate. What made him different was official recognition. In 2009, when Yamaguchi was 93 years old, the Japanese government officially recognized him as a survivor of both Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He became the first person officially certified as a survivor of both atomic bombings. The recognition did not make him more of a survivor than the other people who experienced both attacks. Instead, it corrected his official record. For Yamaguchi, the significance went beyond paperwork. His experience could now be formally recorded for future generations. He had spent decades carrying a memory that most people could barely imagine, and now the government had officially acknowledged it. By this time, Yamaguchi had become a strong advocate for nuclear disarmament. He spoke to audiences about what he had seen. In 2006, he traveled to New York and spoke at the United Nations. He also appeared in documentaries and wrote about his experiences. He wanted people to understand that nuclear weapons were not simply powerful military tools. They affected ordinary people, people who had families, people who had jobs, people who had plans for the next day, people like him. One of the most striking things about Yamaguchi's story is what happened between the 2 bombings. It was only 3 days. Imagine surviving the destruction of one city and then traveling home. You finally reach your family. You believe you have escaped. Then, before you have even had time to understand what happened, another city is attacked with another atomic bomb. And this time you are there again. That is what happened to Tsutomu Yamaguchi. He survived Hiroshima on August 6. He returned to Nagasaki on August 8. He survived Nagasaki on August 9. 3 days, 2 cities, 2 atomic bombs, 1 man. Yet his story was not really about those 3 days. It was about everything that followed. Yamaguchi lived for another 64 years after the bombings. He watched Japan rebuild itself. He saw the country transform from a defeated wartime nation into a modern economic power. He saw the world enter the nuclear age, and he saw nuclear weapons become an issue that could threaten the entire planet. He became one of the people who could speak from direct experience. He was not describing something he had read in a history book. He had been there. He had seen the first explosion, then he had survived the second. In his later years, Yamaguchi often spoke about the importance of remembering what happened. He believed his experience gave him a responsibility to tell younger generations about the bombings. He did not want the events of 1945 to become distant history. He wanted people to understand what nuclear war meant for ordinary human beings. Yamaguchi died on January 4, 2010. He was 93 years old. His death came less than a year after he received official recognition for surviving both atomic bombings. He had lived through one of the darkest moments of the 20th century, and then spent the rest of his life carrying its memory. His story is often introduced as the story of the luckiest man alive, but that description misses something important. There was nothing lucky about the destruction he witnessed. The fact that he survived does not make the bombings less tragic. It makes his story a reminder of how many lives were lost and how many survivors had to live with the consequences. Yamaguchi himself understood that. He did not spend his final years celebrating the fact that he had survived 2 bombs. He used his survival to speak about what those weapons could do. That is why his story has lasted. It is astonishing that one person could be present in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki when atomic bombs exploded. But the deeper story is what happened afterward. He survived, he returned home, he built a family, he worked, he grew old, and eventually he became a witness for history. 2 atomic bombs changed his life in 3 days, but they did not end it. Tsutomu Yamaguchi lived for decades after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And when he finally died, he left behind something more important than a bizarre survival record. He left a first-hand warning from someone who had seen the beginning of the nuclear age from only a few kilometers away. He survived 2 of the most destructive attacks in human history. And for the rest of his life, he carried one message from those 2 mornings. The people who experienced nuclear war were not numbers in history books, they were human beings. And Tsutomu Yamaguchi was one of the few who lived long enough to tell the world what he had seen.